Welcome back to another episode of the Good Question podcast by CoinScheduleTV.
In today's episode of Good Question, I interviewed Thomas Hellmann, Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Oxford's Saïd Business School. I met with Thomas because I wanted to see how he saw business practices of many of the ICO projects that have arisen in the last 18 months, and to see what advice he would give to them and any other aspiring crypto entrepreneur. It was a very pleasant conversation with Thomas, and I appreciated his wisdom on the subject matter. Don't forget to share and like this video, as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. We hope you enjoy. So what parts of the crypto entrepreneurial side of things do you find most interesting and most interesting?
I mean, for me, it is sort of it's a new technology wave. There's a new possibilities that are being opened up. And so for me, the disruption that crypto can bring to traditional business models is really intriguing. I think it's going to disrupt finance. I think it's going to disrupt different aspects of online markets, supply chain. If you go broader to the blockchain, I mean, then there's all sort of interesting disruption happening. But what's new about it is there's a new governance model to it, and that's an innovation that isn't totally obvious, and I think it's sometimes overstated. So people believe that the blockchain is inherently a better model of controlling and governing things. I don't think that's true. There are some obvious difficulties with having this decentralized control, but it also opens up new things that we couldn't dream of before. So that's why it's an exciting moment in time.
So what do you think are the biggest problems with it as a mechanism for consensus?
First, I think the premise of a lot of the, let's say, more vocal defenders of the blockchain, of cryptocurrencies and ICOs and so on, is that there's a fundamental trust problem, and I think that is overstated in some cases. So most people actually trust MasterCard, and if they use MasterCard, it's because there is a deep trust, and I think they sometimes exaggerate the mistrust that exists. I think the mistrust exists more in countries with poor business and governance structures. So I think actually that some of the crypto activity will be more consequential in parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, where people really don't trust centralized institutions. I think in North America and Europe, the level of trust in these centralized institutions is actually bigger, but there is still an efficiency, I think, in certain clever applications where this kind of governance structure will be great. So, for example, I'm quite convinced that some of the complexity in real estate can be solved with a blockchain. Right? And that's now more the general blockchain than supply chain. I think there's complexity where decentralized control and verification really is meaningful. It doesn't mean that I believe every ICO and every hypothesis that is stated in all of them.
Because many people perceive a lot of these crypto projects that are failing to be failing because of they're not following the practices of normal entrepreneurialism. They're not following the best practices that startups have evolved into. Do you think that that's a big problem?
Yes, I do think. I think some of these projects are poorly managed. I mean, this world is constantly accused of fraud, and I think fraud is a concept that is actually sort of too broad, because I think on one extreme there really is people who are just taking advantage of innocence and incredulence of investors. On the other hand, there's just a lot of inexperience and a lot of experimentation, and so some of this is well intended, but we're building a new economic model, and there are going to be lots of dead ends. Where I think, interestingly enough, the principles of entrepreneurship tend to be forgotten is that a lot of ICOs put the horse in front of the cart. Put the cart in front of the horse. Got that one wrong, right? But the idea is that they go and they raise money before they define the project. And in entrepreneurship, it took us a while to really develop good models of entrepreneurship, but probably the most popular framework these days is called the Lean Startup. I'm sure you've heard of it. Steve Blank. Yeah. Really useful, practical tools. Have some limitations too, but really practical tools. most of the ICO startups are completely ignoring the key messages from that, which says you first establish the need, you first understand the customer, and then you go and you propose a solution. But I mean, most of these entrepreneurs are putting the solution in front of the problem, and that's putting the cart in front of the horse. So I think that, and most of these will fail. And so I think there is a little bit of innocence. Because it's a new technology, people assume it's good, but unless that technology has a well-identified use case, unless it has a clear problem that we're trying to solve, I don't think it's going to go very far. Now, there's some additional complexity. If you look at a whole bunch of the ICOs are building the tools of the new crypto environment itself. So some Ethereum is the perfect example for that. I mean, what is Ethereum? Well, Ethereum only works if other people believe in Ethereum and all the things you can build on it. So it's a building block towards a bigger ecosystem that's being built. Those are difficult, but again, the principle of entrepreneurship say that you're not driven by the technology alone, but you're driven by a use case, by a real demand or some problem that can be solved. I mean, and by some sense, Ethereum has now found its place because other people are using it, and so they can point to actual use. The problem with that is that it's a building block. People are using it, but if the end users themselves are building stuff that nobody wants, the whole thing can collapse. Right? So there's that interdependence for the moment.
I see. And what practices would you like to implement within the normal cryptocurrency startup environment? What if you had control over these companies and you could go in as an advisor and say, listen, here's a few things that if you do, you have a much better chance of succeeding?
Yeah. I mean, first, I think the current practice of white papers is just far too superficial.
Okay.
I think that some of the white papers are purely technical papers. Apparently, you can go into China and go to a couple of online services. They will write a white paper for you. You don't even have to have a real idea. So clearly, that level is unacceptable to me. Now, the second thing is basically the ICOs are built on the premise, give me the money and I will build something. And I don't like that premise. I want you to build something, and as you're building something, you get the required money. Now, there's some really innovative concepts, I understand, that some of the money is being held in escrow,
yes,
that things are dispersed as milestones are achieved. I mean, that is a system that we've effectively been practicing in the broader entrepreneurial finance area for decades. Venture capitalists would never give you 20 million up front and then see if you do something useful for it. They give you $1 million and say, here's a couple of milestones. And if you get more, then we'll get a new syndicate together and we'll get new investors, we'll value the company again, and we'll build it up over time. So that basic principles of not wasting too much money, that's one aspect of lean startup, and not wasting too much energy on building things that people don't really need. That message hasn't gotten to all of the crypto world yet. Now, I mean, maybe at the risk of generalizing, I mean, without a doubt, in my opinion, in my humble opinion at least, without a doubt, there's been a real bubble that led to the rise and now fall of ICOs. If there's a bubble, does that mean there's nothing to it? I don't think so. I think there is substance to the new proposals, the new token economy, the network concepts that are coming and are being pursued by some ICOs. But because the hype came so early in the industry, people may have thought that these business fundamentals, building a use case, building a proof, getting some traction and momentum before you go and scale and raise all the big money, those messages have been lost to the industry. So I think we're just going to catch up. And in 5 or 10 years from now, we'll have a well-behaved, healthy sector around the token economy that will be not nearly as speculative as it is today, but maybe very solid and maybe very significant.
I agree. Because you're obviously very well grounded in venture capitalist circles. How do VCs perceive the ICO and the boom and bust that we've now experienced? And do they think that there's kind of a merging coming between the venture capitalist traditional route and the ICO and STO and all that?
So let me give you an indirect way of getting at it. And I actually want to talk about something that's going to make me look like a dinosaur. But I remember well the dot-com bubble and the dot-com bust. And so, there was a new technology, the online world, that was opening up. And, hype certainly got out of control. And it was an amazing boom that then led to a very painful crash and 5 years of picking up the pieces. In fact, by some measure, 10 years of picking up the pieces from the dot-com crash, because a lot of these promises that were made in 1999 didn't happen in 2001 or 2002. So that's when the bubble crashed. Mm-hmm. But if you look at what was said in 1999, most of these things are true today. Mm. So the kind of business models that were proposed, basically clicks replacing mortars, are happening and are pervasive now in our economy. So my favorite example of this is, in 1999 we didn't talk about Amazon, but Amazon is today one of the, I think, second largest company in the world, if I remember correctly, over $1 trillion in value. So enormous. And that was what came out of the hype that crashed, because it didn't take 2 years to build that new online economy. It took over a decade, 15 years, 20 years almost, right? So I want to draw the analogy with the crypto world today, because I think that's partly what's happening. This is a new generation of a technological tool. All of a sudden expectations are getting completely out of whack, and people think we're going to build a new crypto economy in 2 or 3 years. Well, it's going to take maybe 10 or 15 years, but I think some significant companies will come out of it. Maybe an Amazon or something of that nature will exist 10 years now based on a crypto model. If I could predict which one, I would, but I can't. Now, how would you behave in a bubble, right? So we've had these two experiences now. We've had the dot-com bubble and we had the ICO bubble. If you're a venture capitalist, you want to make a good return, and the data is very simple. Those who invested very early on in the dot-com bubble and got out relatively quickly made outstanding returns. Mm-hmm. But there are many, many more investors who came in late in the dot-com bubble, didn't get out in time, and had horrible losses. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you look at the returns to the venture capital industry, they take 10-year tracking averages. For 10 years, you could see the headache of the dot-com boom, dot-com bust, ruining returns figures. Mm. We literally had to wait 10 years for this to be washed out of the figures and venture capital returns looking good again. Wow. So, timing is everything. Mm. So if you're a venture capitalist, basically say, well, okay, there's some venture capitalists who say, I really believe in this and I don't think these things are overvalued, I think they're undervalued, and I really see this as being the new world. There are a few of them, and everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but I think there are a lot more who say, I think this is overhyped, but you know what, this is crazy, and I can make a 100x return over a year, or 1,000x return over a year, and so I'm going to try this, right? So the speculative instincts come out. The problem that happened in 2000 was that it was very difficult to be a venture capitalist and ignore the dot-com boom. In fact, you couldn't raise money unless you were willing to invest in the dot-com area, right? I think a few of the venture capitalists started to behave like that, where they said, this is too big, I can't ignore it anymore. It didn't get as far as that limited partners, the people who provide money to venture capital funds, said you have to do this. They were much more careful this time around. I think they learned from the dot-com boom and they didn't force venture capitalists to go into it. But some of them are open, and so some of them have raised these, very large funds. I think if this is a purely speculative investment, I'm very worried about it. If they are willing to invest in this as a technology that's going to take 10 years to mature, I think they could be pioneers.
Mm. So do you think ICOs will disrupt venture capitalism? Because I remember seeing a statistic which was that ICOs outperformed venture capitalists in 2018 in raising funds for small projects.
Yeah. No, I don't think they will disrupt venture capital. I mean, the same thing was said about crowdfunding, equity crowdfunding would displace venture capital. Mm-hmm. People have said that the angel movement will displace venture capital. I think the best way to think about this as an ecosystem in which each of these players find their right niche in which they get very good at. So angels, for example, are very good at the seed stage. They're now the dominant source of capital at the seed stage. And angels have become so much better relative to 20 years. They're organized, they've got models, they've got networks. And they're really good at that, but they won't displace much capital for the simple reason that they don't have the capital, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know exactly what the niche of ICOs is yet, but I mean, clearly I think we're building a token economy, and therefore ICOs will always be associated with the token economy. Mm-hmm. I think that there's something else exciting going on. Let me explain it because it's a slightly complicated argument. But for me, ICOs is the second generation of crowdfunding. So, in the around 2012-13, the UK became a pioneer in equity crowdfunding. Now, there is Kickstarter and donations. That's one part of crowdfunding, and there's lending, a funding circle, and all of that stuff. That's another part of crowdfunding. But the third segment, which is the most exciting for entrepreneurs, is equity crowdfunding, because entrepreneurs won't get loans on these lending platforms, and you can only get that much on Kickstarter, right? So if you want serious equity, crowdfunding was the answer in 2012. Now the UK is actually pretty much the best place in the world for that. The Federal Conduct Authority has been very open to that. They've experimented, and they built a model that's working. It's not giant, but it's substantial. So Cedars, which is an Oxford-based crowdfunding platform, Crowdcube, coming out of Exeter, are the two dominant ones, and they have a very substantial business, right? Something that they're struggling with is that investors invest in these startups, cool stuff, and then they have equity, and there's no exit. And so they have to really wait for that return to happen. Well, what's fundamentally different about ICOs is that they're immediately tradable, because they're these coins, they're not shares, and there's an immediate liquid market there, right? I think that some of these markets and there's a big need for markets in private shares and private coins. Mm-hmm. And I think the ICOs will morph into two things. I think they will morph into becoming the portal for the token economy, where tokens are issued, and probably in a more regulated, less Wild West fashion than right now. But I think they will do that. But the second thing that they can do is they can create liquidity. And that aspect, I think, is almost underappreciated. Because if you take the bigger picture, crypto and these startups that we're seeing is part of a bigger movement of moving to private companies. So basically, the stock market is shrinking. Fewer and fewer companies want to go on the stock market. There's some real issues about that are coming out more and more about who's really making money on the stock market. So people are wanting to move away from it. We've got the unicorns, companies who stay very much private longer. We've got the crowdfunding movement. I think ICOs come into that they're going to create a way that you can finance private companies, build something, and don't have to go public and don't have to sell, right? But creating these liquid markets, I think the crypto economy is onto something there.
And there's lower barriers to entry than there is if you want to do an IPO.
Absolutely.
Which is a big factor, right? Because if you have so many barriers to entry in terms of legal fees and compliance, and then even if you want to buy stocks and shares, you need to be an accredited investor with all of that.
Well, not on the stock market. I mean, on the stock market, you don't have to be an accredited
investor.
But I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think the regulatory question is still very difficult, because I mean, security tokens offering is sort of the way forward. But if they become as expensive as IPOs, they will be useless, and nobody will want them. So they have to become regulated instruments that is much lower cost than IPOs.
So do you see SEOs becoming more predominant than ICOs, or vice versa, or harmony between the two?
I think that, I think STOs, or SCOs if I call them STOs, have a longer future than ICOs. I mean, the ICO world really depends in some sense on this rogue identity of being stateless or being in a few states that, you know, have opened up very generously, being very light in regulation and so on. But I don't think that's a sustainable model. And frankly, unless the big countries, mainly the US, probably China, probably the European Union, unless they give regulatory green lights, it will always remain this fringe market. Maybe speculative, maybe sometimes large sums coming in, but not a real part of the financial system that is reliable. And I mean, don't underestimate how much it takes to create reliable financial institutions. So I think the regulatory aspect and the trust has to be there. And I'm not convinced you can get that trust without some regulatory framework.
That's fair enough. My final question for you is, if a 25-year-old came to you and said, I want to do an ICO, what advice would you give to them? And how would you explain the entrepreneurial journey to them?
I would say don't start with an ICO, because that's the cart and starting about the horse. Think about the token economy, the new possibilities that we're getting with the blockchain, with tokens. Think about a real customer need, something that somebody needs for that creates real economic value. And then be prepared for a journey that doesn't take you 1 year but takes you a decade. If you have a perspective of building something significant over 10 years, I think you will find you have a better chance of success. I think you will eventually find it more satisfying. But you know what? It needs grit.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Yeah,
I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Real pleasure.
Thanks for watching.